It's really good to see so many colleagues here. Welcome. I'm Bruce Shapiro. I'm Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which, as many of you know, is a project of Columbia Journalism School devoted to improving reporting on violence, crisis, and tragedy all over the world. This is the April 14th installment of our ongoing series of conversations, reporting and COVID-19, conversations for journalists, in which we've been both looking at this crisis and how reporting is affected by it in a variety of ways. Folks on Zoom are free to participate and ask questions via chat. Many of you are also probably on Facebook Live. You're just going to have to lurk and listen and see what you can get out of it. Today's conversation I'm looking forward to very much. Despite the difficult times and the grim title, Documenting Death, Obituaries in the Time of Coronavirus. I'm looking forward to this because, first of all, the question of how we write about death and dying at a time of pandemic is so central to the mission of journalism. But I'm also looking forward to it because our guest is my colleague at Columbia Journalism School, Professor Ari Goldman, who has taught here at Columbia Journalism School since 1993. And before that, he was at the New York Times for many years, where he was on the religion beat as well as other things. He, for many years, has taught a class here called The Journalism of Death and Dying, which looks at everything from writing obituaries to covering natural disasters and other difficult issues. He's also explored death and mourning and aftermath in his own work and in one of his own books, Living a Year of Kaddish, which was about the aftermath of his father's passing. So we're really lucky to be able, at this crucial time, to have a conversation with Ari and see where it goes. For those of you who haven't been on one of these conversations before, here's how it will work. Ari and I will talk for about 20 minutes or so. Then we'll turn it over to you folks on Zoom to ask questions, which you should do via Zoom chat. My colleagues on the Dart Center staff will be filtering those and sort of passing some of them on to me. I'll be asking them just to save the disruption and trouble that comes with people's varying bandwidths flashing up. Ari, good to see you.
Hi, Bruce.
I thought I would sort of start out by thinking about obituaries. We were talking earlier about, first of all, that obituaries have been central to journalism forever, and that in itself is challenged right now, just in general. A lot of local newspapers that used to pour resources into obituaries now rely on legacy.com. So many reporters have less experience writing about obituaries, writing obits, than maybe at the beginning of our careers. But obituaries are also challenged in a special way by the scale and nature of this pandemic. How are you thinking about that? How is coronavirus going to change the art and needs of obituary writing? And I should say, Ari is talking to us from New York, from a few blocks from St. Luke's Hospital, where there are refrigerator trucks parked out on Amsterdam Avenue. So this is a very immediate set of concerns.
And you may hear sirens as we spend this hour together. But I guess the first way I'm thinking about it is that today, everyone is an obituary writer. It used to be, like a special desk or special people assigned to writing obituaries. It's funny, but obituaries are either written by reporters just breaking in or reporters at their retirement. And then people fill in if they have expertise in a certain area. But right now, this pandemic is touching every part of society. And whether you cover fashion or business or the arts, you're gonna have to write an obituary. So I think it's a good time to stop and think, what makes a good obituary? And what's the role of obituaries in telling the story and how comprehensive should we tell everybody's story? How to, even in good times, we can only tell a certain number of stories in a general interest newspaper. So what do we do now that's different? So
you and I were talking the other day about the portraits of grief approach, which the New York Times adopted after 9/11, which before that the Daily Oklahoman had adopted after the Oklahoma City bombing. The idea of giving every victim to a particular calamity the full obituary treatment, something that had not been done before. But you were saying, that's not going to work this time.
Yeah, I could talk about the New York Times approach because I worked there, and my one contribution to the Times that has not stopped, even though I left there many years ago, is I still contribute advanced obits. Mm-hmm. So the Times has started a column called Those We've Lost. And it is different than their standard obituaries. Obituaries, are generally for people who have sub-prominence in various fields, but they found it important to try to record representative victims of coronavirus. So there was a piece the other day in this Those Who've Lost column about a 22-year-old gas station attendant from Tulsa, Oklahoma. There was a 47-year-old dancer, but like a ballroom dancer who also drove an Uber. And they've been writing these shorter obits, and they're not comprehensive. They're not trying to cover everyone who dies, but they're just trying to show the face of this calamity and how broadly it reaches. At the same time, there are famous people who die of coronavirus. John Prine, he would have had a big obit in the Times regardless, but the fact that it happened now made it all the more important to tell his story.
So there, in a way, there are kind of two tracks that we think obits are going to go down. One is those that are somehow representative, that are trying to give a mosaic sense of lives. And the other are perhaps cultural figures or public figures who might get obits anyway, but who people identify with in a particular way. I was struck by the outpouring of kind of grief about John Prine, the singer-songwriter. And even in the week before he died, a lot of people expressing concern for his condition, as though a public figure was someone whose life we could encompass and focus on because we know who they are, right? What do you think what do great obituary writers know how to do? Yeah. What can obituary writers teach other reporters, especially at this time when, as you say, everyone is an obit writer?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of principles, and because I've been teaching a class in this, I have my three principles. Everybody's got to have three principles. One is that an obituary is not a eulogy. So you're not writing a tribute to the person. And more than ever, we have to fall on that journalistic dictum of don't tell me, show me. So don't tell me he was a great person, he was influential, he was powerful, he was beloved, right? No, show me how he was powerful, show me how he was influential, show me the difference that he made in the world. So that would be the first principle. Is it's not a eulogy. You're not singing someone's praises, you're telling their story. The second principle is that obituaries are not about death. You ask an obituary, isn't that depressing? No, it's not, because you're writing about life. The obituary story is about the life of the person. One little fact in it is this person passed away, but obituaries are about life. If the story is about death, then it's a news story. Then it's a fire, right? Mm-hmm. A bombing, an accident. Then the story is the bombing, the accident. And then, by the way, someone got killed. But obituary is, this is the person's life, and we're going to stop and pay attention and consider, and in some ways memorialize it. Um, but the death is incidental.
What?
My third principle, because I promised three,
Yep.
and the third is to give the full lifespan. So we journalists, I'm sure a lot of journalists are watching this. We journalists tend to write what's newsy, what's most recent, what's the, we all worry about what's the lead and what's why should I care? But in an obituary, you have to put in some things that you may not care about, like where was he born, when was he born, what did his or her parents do, what were the, he may have become or she may have become a great success, but what were the person's failures? So it's a different sensibility when you write an obituary than you're just writing a news story about someone.
When does death itself, and I guess I mean the particulars of death, have news value? I mean, we're in a pandemic in which a lot of people are dying, and there is something about the process of people's death, both the medical facts and what's happening to their corpses, that's relevant. We've got mass graves out on Hart's Island in New York City, around in a number of countries around the world. You've got bodies piling up in refrigerators or in hospital rooms. How do we, when is that kind of stuff newsworthy legitimately, and B, how do we report on that and yet be attending to the dignity and needs of grieving survivors? How do we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, those stories are compelling because they're about our neighbors, they're about our friends, they're about our community. They're not obituaries, they are news stories that look at the funeral industry and how is it coping, that look at nurses, look at orderlies. And I think those are very, compelling stories, and we care about them, and they're on page one. It's funny, I just had, I have Sunday's paper here. And of course, this is a story that engendered all the controversy yesterday. Despite timely alerts, Trump was slow to act. He didn't like that story. But under that is, in Regents nursing homes, residents are sitting ducks. So a story about nursing homes and what's going on, inside these places, and the lives that are being lost are really compelling. But I saved this for a reason, not because of the front page, because inside, and this is, we all look for bright spots in journalism. This is one of 3 pages of what we used to call agate. These are paid obituary advertisements. These are people who the Times didn't decide were worthy of a New York Times obit. 3 full pages like this of agate listings at about $100 a line. Yes, journalism is in crisis, but this is one advertising area that I think is sadly a growth area.
In your experience, or the experience of obit writers you've spoken with, when someone dies as the result of or as part of a collective experience, mass death, whether it's 9/11 or pandemic or HIV/AIDS a generation ago, does that at all change the interaction that the reporter would have with families? Does it change families' willingness to talk? How does a kind of collective experience of death change the work of the reporter?
For this, I have to credit the Dart Center, because you've done a lot of seminars on this area, and I feel like I've learned a lot from the Dart Center about dealing with incidents of mass death and of these kinds of calamities. How does it change the interaction? I think for a single person to die in an accident is a tragedy, and it's something that often reporters will have to go knock on a door and have to report on it. When you're part of a bigger community of people who are suffering, I think the personal loss is there, but there's a greater understanding that you're not alone in this, and that perhaps sharing your story with a larger community is helpful.
What do the greatest obit writers know about that phone call to the families, about how to frame the call, how to frame the purpose? How does that conversation go with the best obit writers?
Well, when I was writing obits at the Times, I would call and I would say, I would always express my condolences. And I remember a colleague once looked over at me and says, "Is that the right thing to do?" And I think absolutely. I think, we're human beings first. We're journalists second. We have to extend ourselves. We have to show compassion. We have to show that we understand what they're going through. I think there's also a comfort for people when we begin to open up the life and again, take this emphasis off of death. I'm not calling you because your loved one died. I'm calling you because I want to tell their story, and people want to know their story. And what was he like? What was she like? How did this person become who they are?
Yeah. I want to shift the focus a little bit before we go to questions, because we're focusing right now on kind of the immediate the breaking news part of dying, which is the obituary. But, when this pandemic plays out, slows down, curve flattens, whatever it is that happens, that's only the beginning. There is a long process that is both individual for families that have lost folks and collective for communities and countries. There's a process of mourning and a cycle. You wrote this book about your own dad's death and the time after that, the year after that, in Jewish tradition. If reporters now are trying to plan ahead and think, what's the story going to be in 3 months? What's the story going to be in 6 months? What's my job going to be, so that we're not just abandoning people once the grave is dug, the body is put in, and we move on to the election, but that there's this process that's newsworthy.
Mm-hmm.
How do we begin to focus on that? What are some of the stories, some of the techniques, some of the structural strategies?
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned portraits of grief.
Yeah.
And that was a massive effort by the New York Times to record every life taken on 9/11, some almost 3,000 lives in several locations, right? In Pennsylvania, in New York, in Washington. And what I find is that talking to someone immediately is different than talking to them a week later, a month later, a year later. Portraits of Grief, they collected information for a year and a half before they put that to rest. And I think to stay with the story, to feel that you're not there just for a quick hit, just to get a story in the next day's paper, but to collect these stories and to present them. I'll tell you what I just learned. The New York Times has this special area called Those Who We've Lost, and they're now going to digitize them, make them available in almost like in a running, almost like memorial wall. You could click on and learn about the different victims of coronavirus based on those shorter obituaries that they've done. And the Times, to their credit, they've broken the mold, because usually an obituary has got to be someone important. It's got to be 600 words, 800 words, 1,000 words. They're now doing short 300-word profiles. Now, they've done this before, as you mentioned, in Portraits of Grief, but they also did it in Orlando and Las Vegas. Yeah. And a lot of those stories appeared a week or 2 or 3 weeks afterward, when we look back and try to assess what happened.
And over the course of that arc, how do families change in their interactions with reporters, or even in their needs at any given moment? A week, whether it's a week or 3 months, 6 months, what's different?
I think people are never really over the shock. I think the shock is forever there. But I'll go back to something I heard. I guess it was Chris Cuomo say the other night. He was quoting Joe Biden. He said, there'll be a time when your father, instead of bringing a tear to your eye, will bring a smile to your face. And I think that's very powerful, because you talk about a sudden loss, you want to cry. You talk about someone who lived, and it brings a smile to your face. It's something else. And I mean, in the Jewish tradition, there's the yahrzeit, the annual memorial for someone. And I have to say that, having lost both my parents, the first yahrzeit is horrible. It's very hard. But you know, on the subsequent yahrzeit, you're allowed to have a l'chaim, which means you're allowed to toast that person and that person's life, and you're allowed to smile. So I think that's just a process that we all go through.
Among other things, you teach this Covering Religions class, which is about different traditions and reporting religion across traditional lines of faith traditions. If reporters are going to be spending some of their time over the course of the next year covering the aftermath and the mourning for victims of this pandemic, how do we approach cultural difference? Sometimes we're reporting on our own, sometimes we're reporting on others. How curious should we be when calling families, or just in reporting on general? How do we think about that in multicultural societies, which, you know, we've got a global pool of reporters here in this Zoom seminar. Many of us are in multicultural nations. How do we engage? What are the boundaries of that? What do you think about it?
Don't assume people are like you and that they have the same traditions of you and that they'll react the same way as you do. You know, in some traditions you sing, some traditions you're silent, some traditions you grow your hair long, some traditions you shave your head at a loss. So learn about other traditions and don't see it through your eyes, try to see it through their eyes. How, you know, what's the right way? There's no one right way, and your way, sometimes if you have only your way in mind, that'll distort what you can see. So I call this empathetic objectivity. Try to get into the shoes of someone else, try to see what it looks like from their perspective. And I think with religious ritual and mourning rituals, that's particularly important. The one thing I think everybody has in common is a candle. Everyone somehow lights a candle. And there's something about the candle and the flickering light and the soul. And a candle is almost like a universal symbol. But everything else, when I, as someone who grew up in the Jewish tradition, when I see that, again, when I learned that Hindus shave their head, Jews don't take a haircut for 30 days. So understand that not everyone's going to be like you.
Yeah. We're going to start asking questions, and I'll start with something that Lenka has asked. She says, journalistically, how do we capture grief? What's the best writing style or best storytelling style for in other media to make grief engaging and real?
I think just by not using certain words like grief, or like they cried. I tell my students, you're allowed one cry a semester. And I don't mean them crying in class, but I mean, you can write that someone cried or that someone laughed once, but don't tell me they did it. Show me their emotion and show me their grief. Show me how they're practicing that.
And what are the worst cliches of obit or death writing from? If you were to compile the style book of worst obituary cliches, what would they be?
Well, I think if you look at the paid obits, you'll see many of them.
He was a loving father.
Loving father, beloved. No one was ever like him. No one will ever be like him. And of course, I hope he's watching from heaven.
Layla El-Arian, a past Art Center fellow, says, when is it too soon to reach out to a grieving family member? And is there a distinction in that choice between reaching out to family members of public figures versus private individuals?
Well, I mean, yes. And to the second part of the question, I think you reach out to public figures who've put themselves in the public eye. I mean, I think many of us in the journalism community remember it was Jennifer Levin who was killed in Central Park by her boyfriend. And the years later, the mother wrote about her the two traumas that she experienced. One was the death of a daughter, and you cannot imagine anything worse. And then just being hounded by the press, being followed, being stalked, being haunted. I mean, it was horrible. I know I've learned this from you, Bruce, but you re-traumatize people. That's not our job. I mean, we're not pastors. We're not there to comfort people, but we're certainly not there to make it worse.
Yeah.
And I think finding a way to show that you have the ability to tell their story, and that right now it may be very hard for them to talk, but this is the moment when you could tell their story, and take advantage of that or don't take advantage of that, but you can't force people into that conversation.
Yeah, and I would actually just add to that. At the Dart Center, we have spoken a lot to survivor families of sudden traumatic death like homicide, and found that sometimes that question of timing comes down to even a matter of a few hours. That there are windows in the aftermath of a traumatic event when people are absolutely not ready to talk. And then there's a moment when, if there's a respectful approach, or if they already know who you are, they can engage and want their story ratified. And it's a very subtle sense of timing. It really is sometimes as short as hours, and sometimes it's going to be days or weeks, and it's always going to be different. And what matters in it, that what Ari was just talking about, is that sense of, I don't know if it's re-traumatizing or if not wanting to repeat the betrayal that the loss of a loved one represents. When we barge in with, elbows opening, feet opening up the door when people don't feel ready, we're repeating a sense of betrayal by the universe that parent who's lost a child, or that person who's just lost their spouse has already experienced. And that profound sense of moral violation is, I think, really important. Jaya says, have you ever had to tell a family that the paper decided to cut their obit after you've done an interview? And how do you handle that kind of a conversation when a story doesn't work out?
Yeah. I've had that experience. I've had the experience, of course, of being on the obit desk, picking up the phone, and someone saying, I've got a great story for you, and my having to tell them, well, that's not a story for us. That the paper has decided not to, and trying to convince them that is not a judgment on them. It's a news judgment. It's not a judgment about the life. People will call up and will say, but he read the New York Times every day. He deserves an obituary. You don't get an obituary for being a loyal reader. This comes up a lot in my world, in the Jewish organizational world. People feel like the death didn't happen unless there's an obituary in the Times, and if there's no obituary, then they put in a paid obituary. Yeah. And there was one yeshiva that actually I went to, the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School, where they made it policy that we hate the New York Times because of its Israel coverage, and we're not going to give them any more money for obituaries. And one guy got up from the table shaking, and he says, "Are you going to deny my final resting place in the New York Times?"
There's someone I know whose family calls the New York Times the Jewish sport pages. The obit pages are the Jewish sport pages. Anyway, here's an important question from Carrie Barber. When you're working on obits or other stories about death, how much do you confirm the facts of someone's life? Do you just take family members' word for it? How do you handle that verification question?
Yeah, up and down. You take nothing as gospel truth, except maybe the address and the age. But I think everything has to be verified, because so many people will write, my father invented ice cream, and my and my uncle was at Iwo Jima, and and discovered this or discovered that. Went to this college, went to that college. I know real obit writers. I had Marguerite Fox, who was wrote some of the best obits in the New York Times. She would call universities to make sure that every degree was granted, and not just they attended, but that they got a degree. Now that's a luxury that not a lot of news organizations have, but I think it's really important to check, because people spend their whole lives with grandpa's story of the war, and could be just wasn't true. So to the extent you can, verify, and to the extent you can't, attribute.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from a journalist in India about deaths that are surrounded by silence and stigma. Person saying, I haven't seen a funeral for a COVID-19 victim in India yet. In fact, the health department tries not to reveal names and identities due to stigma that they may face. How should we be thinking about that question, deaths that have stigma attached to them? I think back to the early days of AIDS, HIV, when either people's death certificates falsified their cause of death, or when families did not want to discuss it. There's a tension, isn't there, between journalistic accuracy and social fear and taboo. How do we think about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my mind also goes back to the 1980s and the AIDS crisis, and this convention that papers have of identifying the cause of death and attributing it. So like always says he died of this according to his publicist or according to his family. That tradition of identifying the cause of death and attributing it goes back to the AIDS crisis, because people didn't want to say that my son is gay or my son is an intravenous drug user. There was a real stigma attached to it. I don't think that's what we're going through now. I don't think there's the coronavirus stigma, except certainly not among dead people. Like if your neighbor has it, you might get a little worried. But
I think there's something else which our colleague was implying with this question, which is that there certainly are places in the world in which journalists are trying to report on this issue amid a lot of censorship and secrecy by governments that don't want the full extent of the pandemic revealed. So there's that, and also in which there may be social fear that endangers families, I think was kind of behind that question too.
Right. I mean, and that's, the whole, that's not only in revealing it in an obituary, but revealing, statistics on how many died, in the numbers from Wuhan accurate? Are they, are the numbers from New York accurate? And I know what's testing, what is a COVID-19 death? I think, these statistics can be befuddling and used as all data, to make a point.
Yeah, we have a colleague from Ethiopia kind of pushing gently on your idea of objectively empathetic, and asks, I think seriously, what would be an objectively empathetic way of covering mass death? How do you apply that particular balancing act to large scale death?
Well, I mean, my favorite example of empathetic objectivity is communion in a Catholic church, where you may be taking the body of Christ, but I see you're taking you're having a piece of bread. So like objectively, I could say you're eating a piece of bread, but if I'm empathetic and I understand your experience, then you're communing, you're connecting with the body of Christ. When it comes to death, I think the empathy comes with the survivors, where, there was an obituary the other day about a 106-year-old man who died of coronavirus. Now, you might say, well, this guy had a nice long life, but you realize for that family, for that, for that community, that's a tragedy. You have to get into their experience, and understand that losing their great-grandfather, losing their grandfather, or losing someone in their 70s, 80s, 90s, into the hundreds is a tragedy for them, even as though it may not be for you. So that's what I mean by not just, I think we have to bend the rules of objectivity. I think we have to be objective, but we also, I think the most important thing, especially in covering these tragedies, is empathy.
Your background and your tradition, as you think about obituaries, as mine is in newspapers, the dead tree version. But one of our colleagues wants to ask your thoughts on different media forms. A written obituary in the New York Times is one thing, but TV, digital journalists have a different craft issues. What do you think how can television digital journalists engage in this question while retaining a non-sensational and respectful tone?
There are so many, ways to tell the story these days. So it used to be you had to be in a newspaper, but Facebook is a vehicle for obituaries. Social media in general, people tell these stories in a variety of ways. I think TV, video, I think it's every bit as important and every bit as relevant. And I think the same principles that I outlined apply. The problem is, if you have a limited newscast, whose stories do you tell and how much can you tell? These are compelling stories that people want to know about.
Yeah. What about, and this is certainly something I know I've contended with, what about writing obituaries or death pieces, whether or not they're officially obits, on someone you know well? How do you, as a journalist, approach that one?
I give more weight to the objectivity than to the empathy, because I sort of know that person's importance. I mean, I would say if the person is too close to you, you probably shouldn't be writing the obituary. That you should leave it to someone else. But someone you know well. I mean, it's the regular tug that we have, because if you writing about your neighborhood, you could write it better probably than anyone else because you're an insider. On the other hand, you're invested in it. So I think you have to be careful. But I think you have to tell, I mean, if you are the person to do it, then try to bring some insight into it that you've gained. But again, not in terms of a value judgment, not that they were beloved, but just,
Right.
You could give more examples of why they were seen that way.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also like other occasions on which the reporter's own eyes and voice, we decide, are a distinct bridge into a story. And you may use the first person, but certainly you would acknowledge the relationship and try to build an account around that. I can think of times I've written journalistic pieces about people I knew very well who were friends or mentors, and I've overted that in the piece and kind of thought of it more as a journalistically constructed praise song than an obituary in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
And I think
this just involves transparency and letting people know that I was a fan or a follower.
Yeah, and it's also in those circumstances when it's someone who was important to you. And I think the fan thing is also important because many more times than writing about someone we knew well, we may be writing about a cultural figure or political leader or something who mattered to us. I think letting the reader or viewer know your stance and then making that a way of explaining the figure's importance is legitimate. Here's a question from Spain, from Shana in Spain. How can journalists really help going through grief and overcoming pain? And should we Is that our job? Is that when we're reporting on death and dying, how are we helping? And if so, what steps do we take to do that?
Yeah, I'm definitely from the school that journalism can do good, and that we're there to do good, that we're there to tell the truth, and um, yeah, and we're there to help people navigate through life, and that means like understanding complicated things and explain to them when they're going to get their check from the government, or when they're gonna, or when they might get their job back, or when they can go back outside. I think we're there to help. I wouldn't do this unless I thought it wouldn't be good for society, and that sometimes we're there to help by reporting corruption and by reporting things that go wrong. So I have no problem with helping. And this is a time when people are so vulnerable, when people are often so alone, and when people, can use a sympathetic voice and if not a real touch, then a virtual touch.
Yeah.
And I think it does, I think it does give people a sense of comfort when they see the story told and told well.
Mm-hmm. What about as a craft matter? What are the kind of top tips for writing about or digitizing about death or dying in ways that overcome people's natural reluctance or avoidance of death? These are often stories, and Muriel Alarcon points this out. These are often things that people don't want to hear about on some level. Maybe on some level they do. We ride a certain tension on this. How do you make people want to read death notices and stories about death and dying?
Yeah, there's a great quote from Chesterton. It's like, try to get this right. Journalists, the role of newspapers is to tell us that Lloyd George died, even if we don't know who Lloyd George was. So that, yeah, we want to tell stories in a way that that people will care and people will learn about something they didn't know. I think every day we have that experience of learning about some fascinating character. I'll say, because I teach in a graduate school, I told this to Bruce the other day, that the last time I taught death and dying 3 times, and it's a pretty heavy course, so I don't do it every year. But the last time I taught it, I walked into the classroom, and we have a very international student body, but every student was an international student except for one. One student was from Seattle. And everyone, and almost all of them were from Asian or South Asian countries. And it struck me that American kids aren't interested in this subject, that this is something that makes us uncomfortable, something that we don't want to know about, something that we don't want to engage, something that we don't think really touches our lives because we're young. But I think some other cultures have more connection to death and to the realities of it.
Let me ask you an ethics question. We'll do 1 or 2 more. Ethics question from Sally Ann Duncan. Is it okay to use social media posts from family and friends in an obituary? This will become very important, I think, in covering large-scale death in coronavirus era here.
Yeah, I'll say this is not only an ethical question, it's a hypothetical question for me, because I do not use social media, and I'm one of those dinosaur journalists. So I'm not on Facebook. But I think that I don't have a problem with it if I were on social media, because I think this, you put something out there, you're making a public statement, you're announcing it. I've seen a lot of deaths attributed to Facebook posts, and a lot of anecdotes. So I think it's definitely fair game.
Mm-hmm. And one other question about innovations, and then we'll move toward close, from Manuela Fernandez in London. What do you think about the trend in papers like The Guardian and others, and this is more of a European innovation than an American one, where they have an other lives obit, where readers are sending in drafts of obits. Is this, and then the paper may do a rewrite of it, but it's
Yeah.
still, it's free content on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's making the website accessible. What do you think about that?
Well, I would have said a week ago, I would have said never, I said, that's our job as journalists. But if you go on the New York Times site on this feature, Those Who've Loved, they have crowdsourcing. They say, do you know someone who died of coronavirus? And should we tell their story? Tell us why. And I talked to one of my friends there, one of the editors yesterday, and he said they're getting hundreds of suggestions. I mean, I don't think, I think that gas station attendant from Tulsa or the ballroom dancer from Detroit are not things that, they're not on our radar normally, but people bring them to our attention. And sometimes correspondents will do that, and sometimes that'll take just someone sending in saying, I've got a story.
So in that sense, crowdsourcing of obituaries may turn into one of the enduring innovations from this period, if it catches on as a result. I think we're going to have to stop there. Ari, I want to thank you. I know there are many more questions in the chat, and this is a conversation that can and should go on, and I would encourage everyone on the call to continue this with your colleagues. I want to thank Ari Goldman. Thursday at later in the afternoon, East Coast time, we're going to have a conversation about self-care and peer support with my colleague Kate McMahon of Art Center Asia Pacific. I want to thank for this segment Columbia Journalism Review, which is the co-sponsor. And don't go away yet. While I'm talking, could you all put your pictures on so we can get a screenshot of all the happy faces here for our death and dying conversation. So thanks to CJR. Thanks to Art Center Rockburg Fellow Susan Kaplan, who is of New England Public Radio, who is preparing tip sheets off the back of all of these conversations, to my Dart Center colleagues, Ariel Rich and Kate Black, who have been driving the car behind the scenes while Ari and I just sit and yak. And thank you all for the really good questions.